To have this opportunity to hear from both our court interpreter community as well as from our panelists. Our panelists today are all members of the Supreme Court Interpreter Commission. You will be hearing from Justice Stephen González, Judge Mafe Rajul, Luisa Gracia, Diana Noman, and Frankie Peters. They will be introducing themselves shortly. The purpose of this forum is to get feedback about your experiences as court interpreters during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as to share some insights into the activities of the Supreme Court Interpreter Commission and the courts. We won't be able to get to every question and concern received, but we will look into all of them for future discussions. Now, there are a few housekeeping items that we would like to share with you. All participants are muted except for the panelists and the moderator. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A box during the forum, and participants can view what other people have suggested and upvote the questions that they would want to hear answered. We will also look at the questions and comments that were shared by participants when they registered for the forum. And last but not least, the forum is being recorded. All interpreters will receive 1.5 general credits, and an email will be sent out with a link to a form that interpreters can fill out to indicate their attendance. And then the AOC will add credits to the interpreters' profiles. So we are going to start with a polling question, which will appear shortly on your screens. Please choose which option best describes your working situation since the outbreak of COVID-19. I am interpreting regularly for courts remotely. I am interpreting occasionally for courts remotely. I have done very little or no remote interpreting for court. I have been interpreting in person in non-court settings, such as medical interpreting, social interpreting, social services interpreting, etc. Please go ahead and mark whichever box applies to you the most. And as soon as everyone has finished selecting something, James Wells will let us know what the results are. So it looks as though 60% of the attendees answered, I have done very little or no remote interpreting for the courts, followed by 28%, I am interpreting occasionally for courts remotely, followed by a tie for 5% of the remainder of the answers. I am interpreting regularly for courts remotely, and same percentage for I have been interpreting in person in non-court settings. So at this time, James, did you want the panelists to weigh in on any of that, or should we move on to introductions?
If any of the panelists have something to to say about the poll, they're definitely free to share.
So of our panelists, is there anybody who would like to comment on this particular question prior to introductions? Okay.
Yes, actually, sorry. This is Diana. That is Diana Noman speaking right now. And let me see if I can make the audio a little bit clearer. Just a minute, please. I hope this is better. Or
it sounds very clear. It sounds very clear, Diana.
So good afternoon, everybody. This is Diana Noman. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an interpreter representative on the Interpreter Commission, and I work or worked as a interpreter in the courts prior to the current COVID pandemic situation. And I just wanted to share with all the attendees my current situation. So when I work in 2 languages, and I was, because of the 2 languages, usually relatively busy in the courts prior to the pandemic. And despite also being certified in the 2 languages currently, my situation is that I am only very occasionally interpreting in the courts. My experience has been that it seems like there are only very basically emergent or hearings that can't wait that are taking place. And frequently they have been scheduled on a very last minute basis. So I would say there were some weeks that I had nothing, and then a certain week I may have had 2 or 3 telephonic assignments. So that has been my experience, and I just wanted to share it with the rest of the attendees. And I will end my comment here.
Thank you, Diana. Is there another panelist who would like to address this question before we move on to introductions?
So this is Andrea Beal. I'm not a formal panelist, but I am on the commission, and I am the judge at Puyallup Municipal Court and a representative to the Interpreter Commission for the District and Municipal Court Judges Association. So I just wanted to briefly address that because I just want to express to everyone, it's certainly not that interpreter services are not being provided. It's that we've just really reduced the number of cases that are being heard. And courts are trying to put into place remote capabilities so that we can do things like we're doing now with Zoom and other platforms like Skype, GoToMeeting, or some of the other courts are using those types of avenues to be able to hold hearings as they can. But as everybody knows, this hit us quite suddenly and without a lot of advanced preparation, and we're doing things in a completely new way. So a lot of it is just trying to figure out what we can do and then figure out how we're going to do it and include everyone. So I know everyone's worried when you don't have work after having had steady work, but we are trying to get to a point where we can accommodate more hearings virtually until the day comes where we can reopen our doors.
Thank you, Andrea. Any other panelists that would like to address this particular question? Okay, so now we will look to the rest of the panel and ask that each of the panelists introduce him or herself, starting with Justice González.
Thank you. I apologize for being dressed informally. I'm glad to be here with you. My name is Steve González. I'm a member of the Supreme Court and chair the Washington State Interpreter Commission. And I speak a little bit of Chinese and some Japanese and Spanish, but none of them well enough to be an interpreter. And I respect very much the skill and the dedication and attention it takes to actually be good at interpreting in court and other settings. And I'm very grateful for the work that each of you does. There were a couple of screens I was going to share, but right now, are we just doing the brief introduction rather than the presentation? Is that correct?
Yes, Justice González.
All right. Well, I'm pleased to be here and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you so much. And now if we could hear from Frankie Peters.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frankie Peters. I'm the Deputy Court Administrator for the Thurston County District Court and the District and Municipal Court Management Association representative on the Supreme Court Interpreter Commission. So thank you for having me, and I'm excited to hopefully help with answering some of your questions.
Thank you so much. And now if we could hear from Judge Mafe Rajul.
Good afternoon. My name is Mafe Rajul. I am a commissioner, a member of the commission. I am a judge in King County Superior Court. I have been a judge for almost 2 years now, and I am a former court interpreter. I was a court certified interpreter in the Spanish language for about 10 years, and I have worked, or when I worked as an interpreter, I worked in municipal, superior court, district court. So I can share the experience of both being a judicial officer and advocate, as well as being an interpreter. And I look forward to hearing from all of you. And before I forget, I just want to take this opportunity to tell all of the interpreters how important it is for you to really just not be shy and speak up when you are dealing with judicial officers and in cases when you're having a hard time understanding, when you're having a hard time being able to provide the interpretation. It is important, but now more than ever, given the challenges of remote and telephone interpreting. So I just really want to make sure that you all feel comfortable with just speaking up so that the non-English speakers have the benefit of what you are saying and of your important and great work. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And next,
Can we pause
Luisa?
for just a split second for the interpreter to switch?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. And now if we could hear from Luisa Gracia, please.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here and hanging in there with us. So my name is Luisa Gracia. I'm a Spanish certified interpreter in the state of Washington. And I am also an interpreter coordinator for Seattle Municipal Court. And I'm also interpreter representative in the Interpreters Commission. And I'm very glad that you are attending this session. And I will just kind of repeat what Judge Rajul just mentioned. You need to speak up, make sure you do that, and don't be shy about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. And now I was wondering, Justice González, you alluded to some information that you wanted to share with us. And so perhaps before we launch into other things, you could go ahead and share what you had alluded to previously.
Thank you. I did want to do that. My concern is if I put up a share screen, am I going to block the sign language interpreter?
James, do you know the answer to that question?
Hi, this is James. I'm not sure. I think we could possibly try it, and if it does block the sign language interpreter, we can switch back.
All right, let's try it. By way of description, these are all documents that Bob Lichtenberg and I have spent a fair amount of time together reviewing. So these are all things he's familiar with. So Bob, for your benefit, I'm just going to show the Washington Court's webpage, and we'll just be describing what they are as we see them. So let's see if this works. Are you now seeing the Washington Court's webpage?
Yes.
Great. So if you go to the www.courts.wa.gov, you'll see this picture of the virus, which below will have a link to the Supreme Court order that's 13 pages and was issued on the subject. If you click on that order, you'll be sent to it, and I would highlight a couple of paragraphs that I'd urge you to read. 15 says that courts must allow telephonic or video appearances, here particularly for criminal and juvenile offender cases. And importantly, the defendants and the respondents have to have the opportunity for private and continual discussion with their attorney. This is, of course, even more complicated when there is an interpreter. And as you've heard, interpreters must be forceful in asserting that the order requires that the party be able to consult with their attorney privately. So sometimes it requires a separate line or a separate video or a separate feed so that discussion can be happening. I would also point out in the order, paragraph 17, which says that courts have to make clear restrictions of access and are encouraged to provide that notice in the most commonly used languages in Washington and make every effort to provide translation or interpretation in other languages upon request. And the commission will be assisting with that. And then finally, the third paragraph I wanted to point out is paragraph 18. The ability of interpreter services should not be restricted by emergency operations. Interpreting should be done by remote means whenever possible. This means that if it's possible to do it remotely, General Rule 11.3 can be suspended so that the interpreter, even on an evidentiary matter, need not be present as long as the protocols are followed. And you'll see in paragraph 18, there's a link to the protocols, which gives best practices for telephonic and remote interpreting. There's another great link to telephonic interpreting, and there's the link to a memo drafted by AOC on guidance for the use of interpreters. It needs to be updated slightly, but you'll see it has the basic requirements, the particular revised Code of Washington references that you'll need, safe distancing using assistive listening systems, remote telephonic guide, telephonic interpreting practices, video interpreting practices. So I urge you to use this website, not just to familiarize yourself with the Supreme Court's order, but also use it to advocate for yourself and for the parties who need your services during court hearings if the court or the attorneys ask questions or have concerns about the things that you're asserting are required to adequately do your job. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice González. Would anybody else on the panel like to comment on any of that before we move on? Okay, so at this point, is there any member of the commission who isn't on the panel, AOC staff, and any other guests that would like to share comments or introduce themselves? Okay, James, did you want the second polling question to go first, or should we launch into the questions that were asked when the participants signed up?
Hey, this is James. I'll go ahead and launch that second polling question. Before that, I also just want to welcome everybody to the forum. Thank you very much for attending. We had a very quick response when I sent out the email. I think within 24 hours, we got all of the attendees that that we had space for. Fortunately, we were able to upgrade our the account we have, the Zoom platform that we're using for the forum, so we could allow more attendees. So thank you very much, everyone who was able to attend. And thank you for your patience during some of the technical glitches we're experiencing. This is our first run through, so we're going to be learning a lot from that. But let me go ahead and launch the poll that Maria mentioned.
So once again, once the question is up on the screen, we'll ask that you select whatever applies to you in terms of an answer. As a result of the changes in your working situation, which of the following have you considered? Finding a full-time job that includes benefits, interpreting in non-court settings, such as conference interpreting, getting certified to do translations, traveling more to interpret outside of Washington State, going back to school for more education, brushing up on technological skills, and investing in equipment for remote interpreting? Please go ahead and answer with whichever may apply to you. I saw some answers in the chat. James, did you see those as well?
Let me take a look at that.
We have a comment that indicates that there were no questions appearing on the screen. Hopefully that has changed. And another attendee mentioned that we did not list applying for unemployment benefits, which perhaps we can address later.
Looks like most people have responded. Let me give it another 10 seconds or so for anyone else.
There's another comment indicating that someone is stocking up on continuing education credits with all this free time that we have. Some of the answers are not applicable to some of the attendees. Another suggested answer would have been just waiting it out from another attendee.
I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and the results should appear on the screen.
Okay. So 72%, which is 75 attendees out of 104 of us, answered that they've been brushing up on technological skills and investing in equipment for remote interpreting, followed by 35%, which is 36 of us out of 104, are interpreting in non-court settings, such as conference interpreting, followed by 17%, 18 of us out of 104, finding a full-time job that includes benefits, or at least contemplating that, followed by a tie for 13%, 13 of us out of 104, thinking about traveling more to interpret outside of the state of Washington, or going back to school for more education. And last but not least, 12% of us, 12 of us out of 104, thinking about getting certified to do translations, or possibly already doing translations. So that will give us much fodder for future conversation. And at this point, we're going to proceed on to some of the questions and concerns that were voiced when you signed up for this webinar, this forum. And we're going to start with a concern that turns into a question. Courts are scheduling interpreters at the last minute for telephonic hearings, rather than scheduling them ahead of time and providing a minimum amount of paid time. At least one court is referring interpreters to look up the Lionbridge model of payment, rather than extending the courtesy of explaining that interpreters were not going to be getting paid for a 2-hour minimum for setting aside the time to be on call. Despite the coronavirus, don't interpreter scheduler departments still have a budget to pay interpreters? So why nickel and dime during the most difficult time for interpreters? Would anybody on the panel like to take that question?
Good afternoon. This is Frankie Peters. I can speak to a little bit of that. As far as some of the late notice things that some interpreters may be seeing, most of the courts across the state, the trial courts, were kind of limited to those in custody proceedings. So a lot of the times we're not in the know of any interpreter matter, sometimes until the day of. I know that a lot of the courts are trying their hardest in order to contact interpreters and contact them with as much leeway time as they can. But locally, other courts that I've talked to, I think that's one of the biggest hurdles is contacting interpreters once we have somebody that's in custody, as that's kind of our primary calendars that we're seeing being heard. There are still budgets for all the courts, so I don't have a direct answer to the follow-up or how courts are scheduling interpreters or anything like that. But I think what's really important is to have those discussions with the courts. Judge Beal and I were on a conference call with a lot of the judges and court administrators here just a couple hours ago. And just like we encourage with them, I would encourage everybody here to continue communication. And that's going to be one of the big things, is communicating with the courts that you're working with and having an understanding on both sides of what's kind of going on. Any needs, resources, anything like that. I think communication is really going to be key, and working together.
Thank you so much for that. If there's another panelist that would like to answer, may I please first ask the ASL interpreter if you need to switch out? It's been 15 minutes. Okay, was there another panelist that wished to address that particular question?
This is Luisa, Gracia. As a coordinator myself as well, I will definitely agree 100% with what Frankie just said. And you guys have to think about the needs of the court. Not all the courts are the same. And we are facing a really difficult time to schedule and reschedule interpreters as needed, unfortunately. In some courts, we are fortunate enough, so to speak, that we have a higher need of certain language interpreters, so we can schedule ahead of time, but that's not the case for most of the languages. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. Would anybody else like to address that question before moving on? Okay, so the next question also started out with a concern. It seems as though telephonic interpreting assignments are predominantly being assigned to credentialed court interpreters. Some interpreters are getting a lot of work, while others are left out. Which criteria are the courts being held to when assigning these telephonic assignments?
This is Luisa. I personally follow the rules RCW 2.43, which requires the court to retain a credentialed interpreter. And I think all the courts are obliged to do that as well. That's all I would say at this time.
Thank you, Luisa. We had a question in the chat about not really understanding the nature of the question. Would somebody like to address that? Is the point about it being that credentialed court interpreters, as in certified court interpreters, are getting more of the work? Or how did you understand that question when you answered that? Luisa, for example?
Yeah, that was Parvesha, but I understood that why the job is going basically to credential interpreters. Is that right, or was I mistaken in my?
Yes, the question listed that whoever wrote the question thought that credentialed court interpreters were getting more of the assignments.
Well, and that should be correct. Yeah.
This is James. I think based on some of the other questions I've seen from interpreters over the past few weeks, I think part of the concern is that the jobs may be going to credentialed interpreters, but there's maybe a smaller pool of credentialed interpreters getting them. I think maybe that's, I'm not entirely sure how all courts operate, obviously. I imagine some courts are relying on the interpreters they've always used. And, you know, some interpreters may not have a history of doing a lot of telephonic work. And now maybe because their name isn't out there as a telephonic interpreter, they're getting, you know, not locked out.
I see.
It's hard to, you know, as interpreting, it's hard to advertise your services, especially when there's fewer opportunities in general. Does that make sense?
Yes, this is Luisa. As far as I'm concerned, we don't make a difference within the interpreters. If they're credentialed, we call credential to do either in person or remote. At this point, Seattle Municipal Court is doing only remote, but we always call credential interpreters first. If for whatever reason they're not available or they do not know how to do remote or they're not willing to do that, that is a complete different thing. And then we have to move on and call another interpreter.
So Luisa or somebody else on the panel, could you perhaps shed a little insight into sort of the steps taken where you are supposed to start with a credentialed interpreter, a certified interpreter, and then how it goes from there if one is not able to secure a certified interpreter?
Well, this is Frankie. I can speak to that a little bit too. Like Luisa, at our court specifically, and I know this is a practice that we're encouraging with all the courts. I mean, they should be going to credentialed interpreters first. What we have our coordinators, for example, doing is they're going to end up going to the AOC website, looking at who's credentialed in the specific language and reaching out to them in those ways. And that should be their first step. I know some courts, some local courts are going to look locally first, see what interpreters are around them or any credentialed interpreters that are more or less regulars that are coming into their court for that language. And then at that point, they move down that credentialed list as far as contacting anybody. And based off of this question and the one previously, I think it might end up being a theme, but what's really difficult, and I completely understand what's really difficult on all ends, is having those opportunities to go in and interpret for the courts. Right now, just like the interpreters aren't seeing a lot of business, the courts aren't either. I mean, our court, for example, we're doing Zoom hearings, we're doing some additional hearings a lot of courts aren't doing, such as change of pleas. So our numbers will start gradually going up. We are seeing lows for all matters across the board, just because of what we're restricted to as far as the case types and what's being heard by the case. As opposed to hearing 1,000 cases a week, we're only going to be hearing 100, for example. So those numbers are kind of down across the board. But as far as our recommendations, the commission's recommendations, our courts talking to courts, everybody should still be looking at credentialed interpreters first, working on those lists provided by AOC, contacting interpreters like Luisa said, working out logistics and abilities to meet resources and stuff like that.
This is Judge Rajul. I just want to be very clear at the last portion of the question, which was what standards which criteria are the courts being held to when assigning these telephonic assignments? And I just want to say that the criteria is the same. The court still has the same obligation, and just because we're going through this pandemic, it doesn't mean that the standards are not the same. So we still need to, as judges, if we have somebody that is not a court certified interpreter, for example, we still need to make the good cause finding on the record. So I don't want interpreters thinking that just because this is happening, then we are not holding interpreters to the same standard.
Thank you, Judge Rajul. A very pertinent comment came in on the chat having to do with this, and it reads, a specific superior court uses the first come, first served system when an assignment comes in, and there is a global email, so whoever answers first gets the job, without taking into account the qualifications of the interpreters. So there is a dearth of very qualified interpreters that have chosen not to accept any more work from this particular court due to their practices. Can anybody speak to that, if that happens, if that's supposed to be happening? Okay, so
Judge Rajul, and I just want to reiterate what I already said, which is the standards are the same. And what I will, if there are interpreters that see that this is happening in courts, I would hope that you notify AOC so that we can address, or so that AOC can address that issue or notify the commission, because it shouldn't be happening.
thank you, Judge Rajul. So the next concern, also followed by a question, is the following. Telephonic interpretation may become the new normal, even though it is more challenging for interpreters and may not be effective or appropriate for certain types of proceedings. With regard to life after COVID-19, how will the courts conduct business? Will they default back to in-person interpretation, or will they move permanently to telephonic interpretation?
I'm happy to take that one if that's all right. Steve González here. There are a lot of things we don't know yet about what life will be like. But what I know is that I'll continue to advocate as soon as it's safe that we have the interpreters present, not remote, for interpretation. I think it is still clear that that's the best way to provide the best interpretation for the parties and for the court record. So that's what I'll be striving for us to return to. I anticipate when the stay-at-home order and the court closure order is lifted, it will be lifted in stages, and those stages will include a return to General Rule 11.3. But of course, the future we can't see yet.
Thank you, Justice González. Did anybody else on the panel want to address that?
This is Diana speaking. Am I audible?
Yes.
I just wanted to return to a matter that was connected to the matter that is currently being discussed. And that was, somebody had mentioned from the attendees that there is a certain court that tells interpreters to check out, I believe it was Lionbridge payment guidelines. However, the court was not mentioned. I wanted to suggest that it should be brought to AOC's attention as to which court is doing this. And court practices are completely separate from Lionbridge practices, to my knowledge, and interpreters should not be simply dismissed in this way.
So this is Luisa. The court has been mentioned by one of the attendees, and it says that it's King County Superior Court. And I want to just touch base back to the other question, and what is going to be the new normal, if it's going to be remote or not. Justice González already said that we would like to provide the best possible service, and we will advocate for that. And I want to say that I'm kind of anticipating that some hearings might be now moved, or not necessarily hearings, but short events might now be moved to remote, not necessarily only telephonic, but also video remote.
Thank you, Luisa. Before anybody adds any additional comments, would the ASL interpreters like to switch off? Did any of the other panelists want to address any of those loaded topics we just went through rather quickly?
This is Steve González here again. I'll just say that we do have an issues committee, and I would welcome, if there are particular concerns, such as those expressed, that you send something to us and have our committee address it through that formal process so we can take a position as the commission.
And the details of sort of starting out that official process, Justice González, is there a particular place on the website that the interpreters should look for if they wanted to go ahead and do that?
Yes, or you can use the old-fashioned way of writing a letter. You can email the members of the commission, any one of us. You can send it to me. You can send it to staff at AOC if you'd rather do it that way. So any one of us can get it and refer it to our issues committee.
Thank you very much for that. We're going to move on to the next question. Some interpreters are being asked to work in person in some situations. The Defender Association, King County Involuntary Treatment Court. Why is this the case if the technology exists to do it remotely?
That's a great question. Sorry to keep jumping in. Steve González here again. When I heard about the situation, I called both the presiding judge in the court where it was happening, the interpreter coordinator for the court where it was happening, and the ITA judge, and they have pledged not to do that anymore. If it's still happening, please let me know. I am happy to speak to the administrators and the judges to figure out why it's happening, if it is, to try to intervene and help as I can.
So this is Judge Rajul, and I know that the question specifically indicates King County Voluntary Treatment Court, and that actually comes as a surprise to me because we have been doing ITA remotely, and if
it was being done remotely, sorry to interrupt, it was being done remotely except the interpreter was required to come into the courtroom. Even though everything else was remote, the judge and the interpreter were together.
All right, my understanding was that the interpreter was also appearing remotely, but
I believe that's been fixed now.
okay.
There was one question in the chat that seemed to have to do with this topic. In the one case I needed to interpret telephonically here in San Juan County this past month, a concern was raised about the defendant being able to have a confidential, private conversation with counsel during the hearing. I can't see that happening if we switch to a regular use of telephonic interpreting. Is anybody on the panel able to speak to how that can be addressed in terms of attorney-client privilege if somebody's using Zoom, knowing that you can go into separate little rooms and things like that?
This is Luisa again. So when you interpret via phone and you have to assist with the privileged communication, of course, you're not going to appear on the record for that. So you have to finish that phone call, and the attorney that wants to conduct that privileged communication with the LEP should call the interpreter, or they should have maybe a little room or an area that is private where there's a phone or another device to be able to contact the interpreter.
Thank you, Luisa. There are several questions that have come into the chat. And I'm trying to find the one that had just come in. This question had to do with language line. There have been many comments that I've heard over the years, possibly the other interpreters on this forum as well. And the question is, my understanding is that the courts have been using language line interpreters because they charge less. The problem is that there is no means to know their credentials. I can understand that they have to use language line interpreters for languages of lesser diffusion, but it's important that certified interpreters be assigned first. Does the panel know if there's any way to make that actually happen, knowing that the language line is a go-to resource that many courts use?
Well, if the interpretation is being done in a language that has certified or registered interpreters, then the court has to find good cause to deviate from the use of a certified or registered interpreter and use somebody who doesn't have that qualification. So they have to, on the record, describe why it is they're not using a certified or a registered interpreter. Otherwise, they're running afoul of the rules.
So if one is relatively certain that that is what is happening, Justice González, would your recommendation be, as you mentioned before, to write directly to the Interpreter Commission, or what would happen in that situation if one is certain that that is not what happened?
Well, that's one way to do it. You can let us know if you don't think that there'd be a good response from the court itself. You can also remind the court of the requirements. The rules are very clear. You'll find them in the General Rule 11, and you'll see exactly what's required. And the references are all there in the materials that I pointed out at the beginning of my remarks on the webpage. So you can bring that to the attention of the parties and of the court and the interpreter services, that they must use, and they risk reversal of whatever decisions are made if they don't show that good cause and have an adequate interpreter at the hearing. If they're not responsive, you can certainly let us know and we'll do our best to help out. I have, and the commission has over the years, sent letters to courts when we've been notified of issues that are concerning and said it appears that you're not following whatever the rule is, and we'll outline that in the letter. And the courts have generally been responsive to those letters. Short of that, the Issues Committee can take it up in a more formal way as well. But I'd urge you to go directly to the courts first and remind them of their obligations. And if that doesn't work, we're the backstop to help you.
And so would the first person to address be the interpreter coordinator at the particular court, Justice González?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances. That may be the right answer. They may be the one who is doing the scheduling. Any judge who does that, if it's a particular case, they should be aware of their requirement. There's a very good bench card that we developed and passed as the Interpreter Commission that has a chart that shows you the requirements you have to go through before you could use an interpreter who isn't registered or certified when it's a registered or certified language. You could certainly share that with the judge, that resource with the judge, and also the interpreter services.
Thank you, Justice González.
This is Andrea Beal. I just wanted to mention that in the presentation that I did earlier, the forum, a number of judges did attend that, and part of the presentation did remind them of the importance of using court-credentialed interpreters. And I did specifically mention services such as the language line should not be used for court hearings.
Thank you, Andrea. So another question has come in on the chat. What role can the Interpreter Commission play to encourage and assist courts to invest in technology that will facilitate ongoing remote capabilities for interpreting, including remote simultaneous? It is entirely possible that the need will go on for a while and may arise again. Also, it would allow us for a faster switch to remote interpreting than we had in March, when courts continued to ask interpreters to appear in person long after it was deemed to be a danger. Who would like to take that one?
I'm wondering if someone from AOC is willing to talk about any resources we might have available. I don't think there's a budget right now for AOC to provide that equipment. AOC does do some work with computers that courts use, and it may be that the computers need some upgrading. But in terms of the equipment that interpreters use, it's usually provided on a court-by-court basis. And we don't have a unified court system. Each court is responsible for their own budget. That being said, I think it's important that we give guidance, continue to give guidance on best practices and assist with the coordination of similar technology so people don't, and by people I mean especially interpreters, have to buy multiple different kinds of equipment so that they can interpret in different courts. But I'd welcome input if we have anybody, either a court administrator, an interpreter coordinator, or someone from AOC who wants to join in.
And this is Frankie. There are some funding that's being provided by AOC to the courts. So that's fantastic. It's a great resource. So the courts can get some cameras per courtroom or start looking at those potential upgrades. I will say, as far as that, I mean, it comes down to resources. I know a lot of these conversations are more centered on the I-5 corridor and courts that are along that area. But we have courts all over, big courts, small courts, as everybody knows, and some of those courts just don't have the resources, the availability to have cameras, to have TV. I can tell you, especially after a lot of recent conversations with different administrators and judges, that we're starting to see that pick up a little bit. I know it doesn't feel like it, but we are kind of early in the process for kind of how extreme this pandemic's been for everybody. And a lot of courts are really starting to catch up right now, and they're starting to be progressive and look to what they can do. So I think that we're going to see more courts that are starting to upgrade and starting to look at other means to hold these sort of hearings. But it's just as with anything else, I mean, it's new, and we're trying to keep being progressive and ensure that we have the resources needed in order to get there.
Thank you, Frankie. James, it's 3:56. How many more minutes do we have to know which question to bring up next?
Are you referring to the ones we have on the list already, or?
Yeah. Yes.
I think we'll probably do the kind of final comments or whatever just about like 4:25. So I think we have plenty of time to keep going on the questions.
Okay, excellent. So pertinent to that last comment, again, speaking about technology, there was a comment written by somebody who signed up, somebody who wrote the question when they signed up. And it reads, the use of advanced technology in courts as a backup for situations like this, i.e. the telephone interpreting program, TIP equipment, used in some federal courts, should be encouraged. With the 2 lines and high technology equipment, telephonic interpreting can be much more manageable, i.e. instead of simply using a speakerphone in open court. Can any of the panelists speak to that?
This is Luisa. It is true that that might be more efficient, but it depends on the audio system that the court has. Not all the courts have the same audio system, or better yet, the way to record the record, and some of them do not allow that, unfortunately. Maybe in the long run, when some courts change to different systems, they can consider that option. But as of now, it's not that easy to do. Also, not only telephonic, but we should consider video remote, because technology now allows for simultaneous interpreting with these platforms like Zoom or Adobe or WebEx. So that might be something, budget permitting, the courts may need to look into for the future. Oh, and I want to mention something regarding remote interpreting. There is a couple of interpreters that are working with James Wells, and we will provide training on remote interpreting soon, and that will hopefully it will be made easy. It will be made available for interpreters at a very low cost.
Thank you, Luisa. There is another question, another comment in the chat. Some judges definitely need to learn the ethics and practices surrounding working with interpreters. I have faced difficult situations, and when attempting to speak with a specific judge, I have been cut off in the middle of my first sentence. Any recommendations on that from our two judges?
And this is Judge Rajul, and the only thing I can tell you, and I apologize on behalf of whoever that was, because that's not acceptable. The only suggestion that I have is that you reach out to AOC or you reach out to the commission, because unless we know that there is a problem, nothing will get resolved. And I just want to take the opportunity again. I hope that that is not going to stop people from really speaking up and making sure that the judge and the attorneys know what your needs are when it comes to doing your work in court.
This is Diana speaking, if I can also speak to that. I think it was mentioned earlier by Judge Rajul that it is very important for interpreters from the very beginning of the hearing to speak up as to what is needed for the interpreter to provide accurate interpretation. So I am also an interpreter, and my experience has been that most of the time judges are receptive to that. And some judges now are themselves giving instructions to the participants on the call in a case that participants must speak slowly, must speak a sentence at a time, not interrupt each other, not interrupt the interpreter for accurate interpretation. So if the judge is not allowing for that, or sometimes the judge gives those instructions, but the judge, her or himself, are not following those instructions, the interpreter needs to try to be more proactive and in essence basically just try to cut in and say that interpreter needs to begin interpreting and start interpreting, and then ask the judge to repeat whatever was, let's say, not interpreter, or the interpreter was not able to memorize in that segment of interpretation. So in my experience, that's worked relatively well.
I'll add, Steve González here, that sometimes judges get impatient, and I appreciate that Judge Rajul has apologized for a judge who did that. It's not an excuse, however, and we need to guarantee that we have an adequate record, and we need to make sure that the parties can understand and hear what's proceeding. So if the interpreter is interrupted that way, you can say then or at the end or at some point, and I would urge sooner is better, to say, I'm sorry, I'm not able to accurately interpret. I cannot accurately do my work. Your Honor, I am unable to provide an accurate interpretation to the client, so that the record will reflect that the court is pushing forward despite the fact that you're not able to do your job. The court, I hope, will never do that. So sometimes it takes being assertive that way by making a record that your job is not being adequately done because the judge is not allowing you to interrupt and express what the issue is.
Could I ask for a quick pause for an interpreter switch?
Yes, please. I was about to say that. Thank you. Thank you, Justice González. There was another comment that was brought in, a question when the attendees signed up. There are limitations on site translation in the new GR 11.2. Aren't there restrictions on the kinds of documents in site translate too strict, especially when the interpreter feels confident about his or her ability to site translate certain documents?
I'm happy to look at that. If that's your concern, the interpreter commission can review that rule and decide whether we have been too strict and recommend a change if we deem that appropriate. Thank you for raising the issue. Happy to take a look at that.
Did anybody else want to try to answer that? There is one question in the chat that was also answered in the chat in case anybody else had this question. It would be so helpful if we could get a brief guidance on applying for unemployment benefits. And the answer was the ESD, all caps, website explains it pretty well and offers videos and webinars. Unemployment Law Project also has seminars. Another comment that came through when attendees were signing up for this forum, was culture courses for new immigrants should be offered to better understand the expectations of US laws and how they differ from their home country's laws, such as DVSA laws. Is that something that might happen in the future? Any of the panelists? Excuse me, did I read that out loud? Or was I muted?
Oh, yes, you read that out loud.
We heard
Okay.
you.
Yeah,
Okay,
we heard
so,
you.
okay, no
But there's-
comments on that one?
There's no comments on this one.
Okay, that's fine.
This is James at the AOC. I do know that there are organizations out there that provide those kinds of services. I know of one in Spokane called the Refugee Connection, and they, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but they have in the past done kind of annual having almost an annual conference where they'd bring people and have interpreters from all over the world to discuss certain kinds of issues like the domestic violence and how the laws in the US are going to be differ from other countries, and how there'll be certain different expectations in the US, and there are certain laws that they will need to follow, and what they're at risk of violating. I don't know specific ones in Seattle area, but I would imagine there are groups like that. So if someone is interested, I think looking online, there are a number of refugee organizations. One is the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs in Seattle. I don't know if they run those kinds of programs, but they might have some information on that. One America is another group. I think it's a nationwide group that may have information on those kinds of classes if someone wants to find out more about them.
Thank you, James. There was another comment in the chat about ASL. It indicates we need to set up the video interpreting equipment in the court system for ASL so that court needs to add the video part too, not just the audio portion. Would anybody on the panel like to speak to that?
I agree with that. Steve González, I agree with that.
Thank you. Will there be uniformity in the platforms for remote interpreting in Washington courts, or will each court decide which platform they will use?
Steve González again. We have not a proud history of trying to get statewide platforms adopted in every court. Some of it has been because of funding. Some of it has been a failure to coordinate and get along with each other. It is one of the things that plagues us because we're not a unified court system. AOC doesn't get to order, and we don't get to order courts to buy particular software for case management or to get particular equipment. In some ways, we've improved this for computers by having AOC responsible for the computers that courts use. But we've been struggling just to get case management systems adopted. So I would love to be able to say yes, but I'm dubious about our ability to make it happen. I will certainly work towards that.
Thank you, Justice González. There's an interesting question in the chat. Would it be helpful to add on the AOC lists of interpreters, those interpreters who are available for online interpreting? Meaning, yes, I do have a business Zoom account and am ready to schedule those appointments directly. I am set up and have done some legal work from home lately. It would be nice to have that updated on the website. Maybe an icon or highlight on those interpreters who are available and ready to do remote work currently. Can anybody speak to that?
James, can you take that from the AOC side?
Okay, good. Yeah.
Sure. This is James Walls at the AOC. Right now there is an option for the interpreters can click if they offer telephonic interpreting. Right now, that is the only option we have, but and when interpreters click that, there will be a notification on the person's profile when people are searching for interpreters that they work telephonically. Right now, that's as far as it goes. It doesn't have any further, information such as, someone has equipment ready to interpret. The National Center for State Courts, which is a national organization that is involved with a lot of our, they work a lot with the court interpreter credentialing as well. They recently created a video remote interpreting database. And they also added some different video trainings too that people, or that interpreters can use to kind of get used to video remote interpreting. That's recently come up, and they've recently opened it up for more to add their names. And that information we will be sending out very soon to the interpreters. So interpreters will be able to fill out, I think it's a form they can use to add their name to that, the National Video Remote Interpreting, a VRI database. But back to our Washington AOC, right now I don't think we can add anything to the profiles that go beyond just saying if an interpreter is willing to work remotely or work telephonically or not. But that's definitely something, it's a very good idea though, and I'll take a look at that.
Thank you, James. There is an interesting comment in the chat. I have noticed that recent efforts have been made to translate many essential health materials into 23 languages. This is wonderful and a first. Seattle and King County Public Health. However, the translated information is not reaching the target language populations. This has been necessary for health, legal, etc. for a long time. I wonder if even if courts or legal stakeholders make the effort, will that information actually reach people who need it? I do not expect an answer to this post. But does anybody on the panel wish to comment on that? Or we just heard it and move on? Okay, James, I have a question for you. Is there any way that a person in the audience can speak if the person works for a court? Or should I ask the person to type comments?
Yes. I did not see that in the chat. If I can get the person's ID, I can promote someone to a panelist and allow them to speak.
Okay, so it's Chris Kunich.
I don't see his name listed.
Let's see.
He's connected by phone.
It's kind of way at the top. So start at the top and move down.
Okay, if Chris, if you can just type something in the chat so I can find your name easier, I will unmute you and let you speak.
And Chris is our interpreter coordinator at King County Superior Court. Are you getting an answer yet, James?
I think so. I think
Okay.
it's time, Chris. I'm gonna unmute your talk. Okay, Chris, can you try speaking in?
Yes, this is Chris. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity. I just really felt I would be remiss if I didn't address some of the comments by interpreters singled out Superior Court, and I just wanted to make sure to just address very briefly. Thank you so much for letting me do so. So King County OIS implemented a two-pronged telephonic approach during this time: scheduled telephonic and non-scheduled telephonic assignments. The non-scheduled ones are for unexpected events and matters that slip through the cracks. I think Frankie and Luisa clarified on that need, on that last minute need very well. Thank them both for that. On our end though, regarding payment, both of those are paid as a 1 hour minimum. So there is no attempt to nickel and dime interpreters. We're grateful and happy to have our wonderful interpreters working through this difficult time. The Lion Bridge reference was only used to clarify the nature of the non-scheduled call. In other words, that it could come at any time throughout the day, where as soon as we called, we would be connecting the interpreter to the court. A lot of the interpreters are familiar with private sector companies like that and can understand that kind of a clarification. It by no means meant to imply that private sector models are being utilized for court interpreting at all. This is all clear in the email that was sent to interpreters. We had over 140 interpreters respond positively and agree to this. Most have understood this. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Chris. So we had a question in case interpreters aren't currently reading their chat. Would it be possible to have any training we take for remote interpreting count toward our CEUs? We will be spending time and money on getting up to speed. And Bob Lichtenberg from AOC answered, remote interpreting training will qualify for CEUs. It has to be pre-approved by the AOC though.
And this is James, just one additional comment. I think Luisa mentioned earlier that we have been working with a few interpreters to do a telephonic remote interpreting webinar already. And hopefully that will be available soon. And if anyone does find any kind of national trainings, feel free to let us know about them. And we'll be able to, and we should be able to, yeah, as Bob mentioned, set them up so they're available for credit.
James, could you take a few seconds to tell the interpreters about how if they take different types of webinars that aren't necessarily advertised, for example, on the Notice website and don't have Washington credits, or they themselves have created some intensive study course, that they can try to submit that information to AOC to try to get credits for themselves?
Sure. I think we always stress if you see a continuing education class, and if you would like to have it apply for your credit, try to do so before the event itself, because that makes it much easier for us to approve. I think we do have a 30-day before the class approval date. We do waive that a fair amount of the time, because sometimes people don't find out about the class until the last minute. They hear about it from another interpreter or on a listserv somewhere. But if you find a class, please try to apply for it as soon as you can. And there's a form on our website that you can either fill out yourself, or you can ask the provider to fill out and submit to us. Most providers are always happy to submit a approval form, because it means it will get advertised more widely, and they'll get more people into the class. If there are right now we're seeing, during this, past several weeks, we've seen lots of webinars pop up very quickly. So I think if you do find classes or webinars that you think should be worth some CEUs, you can let us know, and also you maybe let the provider know that you'd like them to approve for credit for it. Again, that the form is on our website. It asks for basic information about the classes, and sometimes asks for a resume or some sort of agenda for the class, that kind of basic information. But then there are other options for independent study as well. Over the years, a number of interpreter groups have gotten together to work in study groups. Maybe sometimes it's, I think, I haven't seen all of them, so this is kind of off the top of my head, but we've had some where groups will evaluate, maybe speeches at the UN, and learn vocabulary from that. And some of you, gotten together and watched, I think documentaries and movies and things like that, something where they can gain vocabulary. And then there's usually a product that you have to have, maybe you're creating a glossary or something like that. That's part of that, that group study or independent study as well. And, I don't think we have a list, but, there's some creative ways I think that people can get credit. And maybe now, since a lot of people do have a lot of time, think about what kind of projects that you could do to, improve your vocabulary or improve your knowledge of a certain area, a certain topic. And yeah, that might be a good way for people to spend some of their time and also keep in practice, because I know if you're not working, it can get the interpreting skills might get rustier than you would like. So that's certainly an option. And there's forms on our website that kind of describe the kinds of information we would need that might guide you, as you think about these projects. And that's all available on our main website under continuing education.
Thank you, James. And on the topic of continuing education credits,
sorry to interrupt.
Does the ASL interpreter need to switch out?
Yes, please.
Sorry. And on the topic of continuing education credits, this is Maria Farmer, and I'm one of the Notice board members. And for those of you who aren't in Notice, and certainly for those of you who are, please keep looking at our website, because we're working very hard to try to find valuable opportunities for you to get your credits. We're trying to make them either free or very, very inexpensive, so that we take into account the fact that a lot of us aren't working all that much. And there's a variety of things, everything from actual subject matter coming up, like remote interpreting, consecutive interpreting, things like that, as well as things for our mental well-being. So please make sure that you're checking in on the Notice website so that you can take advantage of those things. And panelists and James, there was a very positive comment that says, before we run out of time, I want to express my deep gratitude for this opportunity to meet with those taking the lead in our profession. In my 34 years in the business, this has been one of the most enjoyable sessions I've participated in. Could we do this a few times a year, at least until we have our 16 credits? Just kidding, of course, but just wanted to share that with you. And so, James, how many more minutes do we have? And did you say that there were going to be closing arguments on behalf of the panelists, or?
This is James. First of all, thank you very much, who said that in the chat. I'm going to maybe look at that and copy and paste it so I can keep a little list of positive comments to help myself go through some of these days. I think, yeah, maybe just have the last 5 minutes for panelists, if any of them have any closing remarks they'd like to say. My only kind of closing elements was just to let people know that they can feel free to email me and Bob at any time. I don't have the slide ready with all of our information. I don't want to block the ASL interpreters, but I'm sure everybody has my email at this point. So feel free to email me at any time, and I can always forward it on to another person if they would do, if it's more appropriate for them to take care of.
So James, there are a few questions that may not get answered, one in particular about unemployment questions. Is it possible for you to say your email address out loud, just in case they don't go to the AOC website?
Sure, and I'll make it a little easier. There's an email address that actually goes to me and Bob. So our joint email is interpreters, so INTERPRETERS at courts, COURTS.wa.gov. And I'll type it in the chat too, so it's a little bit easier. And those emails will go to me and Bob. And I will also send out to all the interpreters, all the credentialed interpreters, a link to the ESD, the Employment Security Department website. They've recently updated it to include information for self-employed and independent contractors, which almost all the interpreters are. So I'll send that out probably on Monday.
Thank you, James. And so before our time is over, is there anything in closing comments that the panelists would like to share with us?
This is Judge Rajul, and I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate this afternoon, sharing your concerns, your ideas, and your questions with us. I just want to tell you that even if there are times where you don't feel that your job is appreciated or valued, we do value and appreciate what you do when you are interpreting. And I am a firm believer that we all learn from adversity, and positive things do come from adversity. And so hopefully this will be a time when we will be able to come up with some new ideas and just be stronger. And please just keep up with the good work. And again, don't be shy to let the court know what you need in order to do the so important, valuable job that you do. And thank you.
Thank you, Judge Rajul. And we have an important question here, James. I forgot the answer. Is this session recorded? If so, will you be sending us a link?
Hi, this is James. Yes, it is being recorded, and I will be sending out a link. The video, it takes several days for the video to be ready. So it'll probably be sometime next week. And I'll also be following up with a link to kind of a survey for the forum, where people can leave kind of an evaluation of it. And it was also be a form where interpreters will kind of digitally sign to let us know that they attended the forum, since not everyone registered attended, so we can't give everybody credits who are registered. So we'll send out that form to everybody, so interpreters can sign that to kind of verify that they were here.
And I don't think that James Wells was officially introduced at the beginning, but James did a lot of preparation for this webinar. So I know that I certainly would like to recognize him and thank him for everything that he does for the interpreting community. as well as Bob, who's on the telephone. And also, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for your time, and not trying to cut you off, but wanted to make sure to thank you before this is officially over. So is there another comment from any of the panelists as a goodbye?
Thank you very much. Steve González as chair. Thank you to the interpreters who've been helping us here today on the sign language side, and for everyone else who's participated for your good faith questions and for our effort to make things better and to make justice more a reality. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you, Justice González. So if there are no other comments, James, is this about the time where we would be wrapping it up?
Yeah, this is James. I think, yeah, if any other panelists have any other comments, I'll also just say my thank you to everybody who's here, all the panelists, very much so for being available today, to all the interpreters who are, attending, and especially to the interpreters who are, the ASL interpreters who are actually interpreting right now. And also thank you to the people who are using those ASL interpreters to access the forum. Appreciate everybody's patience in getting all of this set up. This is our first kind of online forum, and I think like everybody else, we've being pushed into this kind of new world with the courts with the telephonic hearings. It's moving us too into that kind of era. So I think the online forums are much more easy to access for people than in-person ones a lot of the time. So I think this will open up doors to more sessions like this. And yeah, thank you very much to Maria, who is moderating this. She's done a fantastic job. I didn't necessarily know what to expect from the forum, so I didn't always know how to get her ready for it, but I think she's done a great job. So yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, James. So then, do we all hang up now?
Yes. Bye.
Yes.
Yes, this is this forum is now closed. I'll be emailing all the interpreters with the link to the videos and to the links we've mentioned today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.
Thank you. Adiós. Hasta luego. Gracias.